Hey guys, welcome to Craft Extra. Rhett here holding down the fort while Jeff is working on some other projects. Uh, Today, I wanted to invite Aidan Moher onto the show to talk about a book that he released last month. It's been about 4 weeks now, right? I think so. It's called
Tomorrow,
Fight.
yeah, tomorrow will be 2 weeks or 1 month. That's right. Yeah, there it is.
Perfect. It's called Fight Magic Items, the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. And if any of you have ever listened to our live weekly stream on Wednesdays, Talking Heads, you'll have heard us talk a lot about JRPGs. And so it's no surprise that having a whole book, a collection of essays, is a pretty interesting thing. And Aidan here is quite the writer. I actually have been following you for quite a while on Twitter. Big fan of your astrolabe. I use your how to pitch post as sort of like a Bible. Like anytime I'm getting ready to like pitch an article or something like that, I've always got that open. Like, all right, what does Aidan say about getting this done right? So
Yeah, so I've been around online for a long time, since about 2007 when I opened a blog about science fiction and fantasy books called A Dribble of Ink. Ran that for a number of years. It went on to, fair success, which was great and introduced me to a lot of people. Really helped my hone my skill as a writer and a critic. And over that time, it started out mostly as books, but I've also always, for my whole life, my two loves have been epic fantasy books and Japanese RPGs. And so I started to cover Japanese RPGs a little bit on A Dribble of Ink here and there, and had fun doing that. And also noticed that my readers liked it. So the same people that liked science fiction fantasy books also seemed to like Japanese RPGs. No surprise. And so A Dribble of Ink ran until 2015. I won a Hugo Award for it along the way, which was pretty great. And then I decided to close it, right? About a year after I won a Hugo. And that's when the blogosphere was starting to change. But I also had a lot of personal change in my life. I had my first child was born, and we were moving, and things were changing. And I wanted to be able to kind of pursue writing from a more like professional angle. And so that led me into doing some freelance writing, and then eventually taking that idea that, hey, people who love science fiction and fantasy books often also like Japanese RPGs. But that's not just true for readers, that's also true for writers. And so I sort of made my debut a few years ago on Kotaku as like a pro games writer, doing a story on how Japanese RPGs like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest have inspired a generation of science fiction and fantasy writer, like just as much as Le Guin or Tolkien or Terry Brooks or Robin Hobb have. That they pull as much from Hironobu Sakaguchi as they do from like the traditional sort of epic fantasy inspirations. So I wrote that. I talked to a ton of amazing writers, and sure enough, they all, had the similar experience that I did. And then readers really like glommed onto it, and I got so many DMs on Twitter being like, "Hey, why didn't you talk to me for this piece?"
of course.
About JRPGs and writing. I was like, it was like 10,000 words as it was. I only had so much room, but that like really sort of lit that fire, where I saw this kind of connection to these experiences that I've had in my life, and as a kid growing up playing these Japanese RPGs. And as an experience that other people had, and I didn't really see that space being written about in games writing a lot, like pulling forward like how our childhood or our teenage experiences sort of shape who we are now. And so I started writing more about Japanese RPGs for places like Electronic Gaming Monthly, and I've written for Wired, I've written for a whole bunch of places, but always sort of like tying back to like how nostalgia and how our experiences over our life inform what we want today, what we remember today, what we enjoy today. And so I wrote a lot of these stories about Japanese RPGs, and I'd pull on my own personal experience, and eventually a fan of my games writing named Eric Smith approached me. He also happens to be a literary agent. He said, "Hey, Aidan, like, when are you going to send me a book with just your essays, your JRPG essays?" And I said, "I could do that, but I realized I didn't have the volume to fill out the whole book." So he's like, "Okay, let's do an essay collection." So I started looking into that, and eventually, as we worked on an outline, it was like, well, let's just do the whole story. Let's do the story of Japanese RPGs. How were they created? Who created them? Why did they create them? But then also from the angle of like, how did these sort of strange Japanese RPGs find such a vast audience in the West? Like, they're very, very Japanese games, and they were made by Japanese creators for a Japanese audience. So why did they make it big in the West in the way that they did? What caused that? You know, how far back into their history do you go to find the origins of that? And it turns out you go right back to the very beginning. Like Japanese RPGs, as I cover in the book, which is right here, they were inspired by Western RPGs, right? So you have the creators of Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy, and they were big fans of wizardry and Ultima, which in turn were inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. You know, and then so you have these Japanese creators wanting to bring that Dungeons and Dragons experience into Japanese living rooms, and they're looking to Western games for inspiration. And by the time Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were being created, their American programmer, a guy named Nasir Gabelli, he was an Iranian American. He developed and programmed the first one. By the time he was doing the second and the third one, he had some issues with his work visa in Japan. And so Final Fantasy 2 and 3 were partially developed in Sacramento, California. And so you go all the way back to the beginning of the genre, and it's like, okay, there's this like cultural exchange right from the very beginning. And where's the story there? And how far does it go back? And then, you know, so I went back and I looked back at childhood and teenage years and what these games meant to me, and how that was a shared experience among hundreds of thousands of people in North America during the 80s and the 90s. And then it turned into millions of people in the late 90s when Final Fantasy 7 came out. So I dug into that story, and it's like, I don't quite call it a memoir, because I don't think the stories, you know, they pull on my personal experiences, but they're not about me. They're about fans. They're about people, you know, who have these shared experiences. And I put that into the book. And so it's about Japanese RPGs and the people who made them and the people who played them. And that's sort of the core idea of fight magic items.
That's great. And I do think like you really start out like really personal in the book, and then but then you hit this like just great reported sort of stride. And I loved the amount of research that you clearly put into this. And like what really stuck out to me, especially the sort of beginning of the JRPG era, was how similar it sounds to, I'm always surprised by this, especially like in games or whatever. And I've been sort of in the game dev sphere for like 5 or 6 years. It reminds me of how you hear stories about how genres of music kind of came together in certain eras. There's the same players with their own unique style that are sort of informing each other.
Yeah.
And like, that's really kind of what happened in the early days, it sounds like, especially between like Dragon Quest to Final Fantasy. And then you have, you know, just like the injection of like something really unique when Mother comes out. But it is interesting how nothing really sort of evolves in a vacuum. You know, you're talking about the cultural exchange of these ideas. And what's interesting is that we look at the JRPGs and we see how they were kind of drawing influence from these Western things, especially Dungeons and Dragons, like you clearly lay out at the beginning of your book. But it's kind of interesting when you think like, what do Western creators do when they want to make something? They're going to draw from those other cultures. But when we see it sort of like reflected back at us so effectively the way that JRPGs have done, I feel like there's been sort of an interesting, like people find that so like unique, even though it's kind of a universal thing.
What's interesting is I'm pretty sure it's Dragon Quest. You know, to us, it feels very generically like faux European fantasy, right?
Right.
It feels like, you know, like it was like, you know, a 7-year-old went and wanted to make a D&D world, and it's got knights and it's got dragons and it's got skeletons. And that feels very normal to us and cliche, but Horii actually specifically chose that setting because in Japan, culturally, it was seen as exotic, right? And so we see the opposite of like these games that are made in Japan. They come over and they have these like touches of Japanese mythology or history or culture, and that feels exotic or different or exciting to us. Whereas we see the things in Dragon Quest, and we're like, oh yeah, that's very typical, traditional, faux European fantasy. But it wasn't like that. And Horii drew on that specifically because he wanted to evoke this feeling of this like exotic other world.
Right.
Which was just so interesting because we don't often see that perspective as Westerners, right? Like Western culture consumes other cultures, it takes from other cultures, right? And so to see something take, that a different Eastern culture taking that Western mythology and turning it into something else is really fascinating. And Japanese RPGs have always done that, right? Like you see like Gilgamesh being in all the Final Fantasy games, the later Final Fantasy games and stuff, right? Like taking this sort of other mythology and bringing it into something. And your background as a Western player is going to be different than Japanese players, and I think that cultural exchange is just sort of fascinating with that genre in particular.
I read a couple books from M.J. Gallagher. Have you ever read any of it? He writes a lot about the different like sort of mythologies that are interwoven throughout the Final Fantasy series. And so like I have one that's like Norse mythology in Final Fantasy. And he just kind of touches on it.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
One of the things he points out is that how really it all does flow from Dungeons and Dragons, even this mythology, because Dungeons and Dragons had sort of absorbed a lot of that. Like, even if it wasn't the totality of Norse mythology or whatever, it had enough that these people could then go and research more and do this and bring it in.
But that's what I think, like you brought up Mother earlier, and that's why I think that Mother and Phantasy Star, like Rieko Kodama's work on Phantasy Star and Shigesato Itoi's work on Mother is really interesting, because Sakaguchi and Horii went for that traditional Dungeons and Dragons motif, right?
Right.
Kodama and Itoi went, okay, like this base like template for a game is really interesting. I think I can do something new with it. And Itoi went and looked at like, Midwest US like backyards, right? And small town like USA to set this fantasy story. And Kodama went and said, okay, like instead of a fantasy world, let's do like 3 sci-fi science fantasy worlds, right? And like all of a sudden that blew up the scope of what the genre could be. It wasn't just Dungeons and Dragons. It could be so much more, even if sort of those 2 original game series focused on that sort of faux European Dungeons and Dragons feel. It fascinates me that so early on we saw that expansion into like really interesting, like I don't think there were any tabletop role-playing games that were set in like small town USA at that point, right?
No,
we're so used now to tabletop RPGs having this vast array of different settings and play styles, but I mean, I don't know for sure, but I doubt that there was like small town USA like tabletop game back in the 80s. But Itoi was doing that, and the industry was nimble enough. It wasn't, beholden to quarterly profits. Teams could be tiny. You could have that one visionary sort of like creator, a small team around them, and they could create something really interesting without the pressure of like, having to sell 15 million units or whatever.
Right.
That kind of comes into play with a lot of these series at this point.
Yeah. That's kind of like the big thing with, we've seen some of those series evolve and sort of join the ranks of AAA, gaming or whatever. And that is sort of the big drawback with AAA is that, like you said, you got quarterly profits, you got all this. It's less about, I'm not going to say that there's no art in it, because there's so many people involved in these studios that are pouring their heart into these games. But
I think like you look at Final Fantasy 15, right? And I'm pretty sure it's the most successful, like, or at least highest selling Final Fantasy of all time, but it was very clearly like it took 10 years. It was in like basically took 10 years to make. And I think that all came down to like the clash between corporate culture and creative culture, right? Like there were so many false starts with that game and that overarching series because the kind of visionary creative side of things didn't match up and didn't work with the corporate ambitions for the series. Whereas you see like something like Dragon Quest 11, which took a long time. Like Dragon Quest 11 was like the series HD debut. Like you have to go back to like 2004 for the last console version of that, right? That's 13 years. But it also had a, like kind of small C conservative outlook on how to make a modern Japanese RPG. Like Dragon Quest 11 feels like Dragon Quest 3, right? it didn't sell as well as Final Fantasy 15 in the West, but it sold pretty well. But it was also, like it wasn't the expectations for it to become like the AAA title, that would support, multiple years of growth for the series. Didn't exist like it does for Final Fantasy.
It's kind of interesting looking back kind of in hindsight, and you were talking about how many fantasy authors have been inspired by JRPGs. And I think that there is definitely like a generational sort of thing, because I feel like people that are my age, and I'm 31.
Okay.
I feel like people like, especially that I went to high school with, like there was like a handful. I did go to a small rural high school, but there was like a handful of us that played and enjoyed JRPGs.
Yeah.
But I was exposed and sort of fell in love with it through my brother, who was 8 years older than me. And so like growing up, like, man, when he got a PlayStation and he got his hands on Final Fantasy VII, he had already been playing other games and stuff before. And so I kind of learned it in reverse from there. It was like watching Final Fantasy VII. It's like, oh my God, this is great. Well, we had a Super Nintendo. And so when I managed to find Final Fantasy III at, the flea market, it was like, oh, this is great, and then my brother was playing Chrono Cross and he was like, well, yeah, this is like a sequel, there's Chrono Trigger. It's like, what?
Yeah. It's funny because I was the older brother in that situation. Like, I had two younger brothers. My middle brother was more into sort of Western games. He loves Fallout and stuff like that. But my youngest brother was into JRPGs, but he was 6 years younger than me. So, and he has really fond memories. We just hole up in my bedroom and I would just be playing through Grandia, right? And so like my brother was like, he was maybe 8, right? So he wasn't old enough to really like, really get into the game itself, or he probably wanted to, but he was happy at that point just spending time with his older brother, kind of bonding over these these games and stuff. And then that led to the exact experience that you're talking about. Then as he grew up over the years, it was all of a sudden he had access to all of these games and like this history of games that I had in my closet. And that sort of led him into his own journey through Japanese RPGs. And it's like that ability for their single player games, but like somehow they have that ability to bring people together, right?
Yeah.
And I grew up in a small island community. And like, I don't know why, but Japanese RPGs and anime and all those things that were like, supposed to get you ostracized, by the community at large, or like, make you a target for bullying or whatever, like geeky stuff. All of that was cool in like my community and at my high school. Like those were the things that like I like connected with the older kids over. Like, like we would share games with the kids a few grades older than us, and somehow I just lucked into that situation. And like the way that our friend group like bonded over these games, and I talk about it in the book, like I would haul my old Commodore monitor and my PlayStation over to my friend's house. We'd set up back to back and play Lunar together. And like these are single player games, right? We'd each play our own version of Lunar, but it was like there's that social element of people playing them together and experiencing them together that I think was like really intense during that period. Discussing stories and tips and helping people get through things, and that element of it is so, so many people look at them as these just solitary experiences, but that wasn't what it was like for me at all. It was like very much a social thing.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I did with my brother. I would sit there and watch him play. And I remember like my mom would work late, and so I'd be up past midnight watching him play. And he was like, you want to see something cool? But if you ever tell mom, I'm going to punch you or something, and he would like make, he would make Sid like curse or whatever in the game. And he's like, he's saying bad words. Isn't that awesome? I was like, yeah, it is.
Yeah. Totally. And it's funny how the different experience, like that age group makes you experience the games in different ways too, right? Take away different things from those games.
I just finished Lies of Locke Lamora, and it was kind of funny, like going back and reading your Kotaku article about that. Like they really informed my creative sort of inspiration, my creative vibe, but I didn't think about it as much until I got done, read your article, and then I could sort of reverse apply it to reading Lamora. But now it makes me wonder too, like something like Stranger Things, like, that kind of was the vibe I was getting when we were talking about Mother and Earthbound. It's like, well, hey, I wonder if like the Stranger Things guys, like, drew something from there. And now, as far as TTRPGs go, like you do have stuff like Tales from the Loop, which is kind of a science fiction sort of cross-dimensional inspired thing, but where you play kids in these situations that are sort of learning to navigate these difficult social situations. But it's kind of interesting going back and started like, right, like, oh, that I see the flavor there now. I see the flavor in that show or that movie or whatever.
Yeah, well, and it's funny too, because I think, like you were sort of saying, like a lot of people don't necessarily recognize that this is where that inspiration came from, right? And that's something that, like, for me as a writer of, because like I write nonfiction, but I'm also a fiction writer, right? And for me, it was like, I didn't think I was allowed to be inspired by Japanese RPGs, right? I didn't think I was allowed to be bring elements that I loved from those into the books that I wanted to write, right? That was somehow like, improper. But a few years ago, I was in a conversation with some people on Twitter, and an editor and an agent, and they just said, like, lean into it, write what you love, right? Bring that into it. And then I started to talk to more authors, and people like Scott Lynch, who wrote Wise Loch Lamora, and being like, yeah, like Loch Lamora is named after Loch Cole from Final Fantasy VI, like just straight up, right? And it's like, oh, okay, like I can totally be inspired by these, because these things do inspire me. And like, you don't necessarily have to write a fantasy book where people are like going into their accessories menu and like equipping like their magical accessories, but like those were always abstractions of ideas that existed within fantasy narratives anyway, right? Like equipping your items in a menu in a Japanese RPG is, the equivalent of Sheoms for getting this sort of Shannara and then, using it against Brona at the end, right? Like, he finally, it had a level cap of level 60, but he had to get there over the course of the book. And then finally by the end, he figured out, and, he grew and he could finally wield the sword against Brona. And, it's all abstractions of things that existed within Lord of the Rings and other fantasy books, right? And so, like, how do you take those ideas, those feelings, and those emotions? And that's ultimately like what I really wanted to pull forward in this book, is like, these are all like passionate, emotional people creating things that like evoke feeling in them as creators and evoke feelings and emotions in players. And so, like, who are these people? And so, like, in the book, I constantly try to dive into, like, I did a lot of research, as you kind of mentioned earlier, and tried to dive into interviews and find the stories about, like, who are these people and why were they making these games the way they made them, right? Like, not necessarily just like what was the industry like, or what was the financial implications of Final Fantasy, but like, who was Sakaguchi? Like, how did he go from being somebody who wanted to be a musician to basically falling in like backwards into making video games? Like, he was working part-time at Square, like making games and stuff. And he didn't really join Square full-time until after Final Fantasy. So, like, how does that happen, right? Like, how does a musician end up making like one of the most popular video game series of all time? And what's like really fascinating right now is, like, it's really challenging to write like a history that's like in progress, right? And so this book comes up to the modern day, right? Like, I talk about Xenoblade Chronicles 3 in it very briefly. It's really hard to write about an ongoing living history, but it also means, like, we're in a really unique place where there's a legacy of Japanese RPGs. There's a history, there's stories to tell, but the creators are still around. Like, not only are they around and alive, but like they're making games, right? They're talking about their work and they're looking back on their work, right? So the book closes out with Hironobu Sakaguchi looking back at his career, wondering if, his game for Apple Arcade, Fantasian, like, is this my last game? Did I do myself proud? Like, did I do what I wanted to over my career? And so, like, being able to tap into that is just an incredible opportunity, right? Because, like, in 50 years, these people will be gone. We lost Rieko Kodama earlier this year. She helped create Phantasy Star, and like, she's gone. She can't tell more stories. So whatever is out there now, that's it, right? But there's such a treasure trove online of old translated interviews with a lot of these creators that I was able to like really dig into, like, who are these people? Like, not now, not necessarily like who, like, what do they think of their games from the 80s now as mature creators, but what were they thinking in the moment? Like, what did Hironobu Sakaguchi think of the Final Fantasy series in 1989? And so that all exists online, and through lots of research, you can find these stories and like really learn, like, who are these people? What like emotions drove them? What were they hoping their series, would accomplish? And I find that those stories are just really fascinating. And so I wanted to put that like heart and soul into this book. And I feel like I did a pretty good job of balancing like, fans as people and the emotions that we have, but then also creators as people, right?
Yeah.
And imperfect people. Because a
Yeah.
lot of the time, and like a review that I read recently of the book, I don't read reviews. Like, I know you're not supposed to read reviews of your book, but this one, what really stood out to me is it appreciated the way that like the book doesn't gloss over like the flaws or try to hide the like imperfections in these people, because they were creators that were learning, and there are mistakes and they're not perfect people. But that's what makes it interesting, right? Is being able to find that and see how, maybe imperfections or mistakes early in their careers shape later stages of their careers, shape these games, which in turn sort of shape the overall industry. And just being able to dig into that now with the resources that exist, with the fact that this is an ongoing story, it was really fascinating as a writer. And I'm glad that that's working for readers as well.
You also gave me like a really new, profound appreciation for Pokemon. Now, I was a generation that just like Pokemon swept my school, man. Like fisticuffs in the schoolyard over Pokemon cards and things like this. Like, and you really put it into perspective, like the genius of, and it shows you their legacy to this day, how Pokemon was taking people out into the public. They were taking them out into the world. We were interacting with each other to trade Pokemon to get those ones that you can't get on your cartridge, battling each other. Pokemon Go does that to this day. Like, that's the legacy of Pokemon. That blew my mind, because I don't think I appreciated quite what I think. I just envisioned Pokemon sort of like a vehicle for like shipping toys essentially or something, but it really kind of wasn't that.
It was that also, right?
Well,
and but that's what's fascinating about Pokemon. And like, if you enjoyed that part of the book, Daniel Dockery has a book called Monster Kids. It was published the same day as Fight Magic Items, from the same, like, we shared an editor, same publisher.
Nice.
It's called Monster Kids, and it dives into that era of Pokemania, where it looks like more deeply into the history of Pokemon, what it was meant to be, and then what it spawned and how it transitioned into becoming this like mega like success in the West. And he has like some incredible insight into how all of that happened. But I think like your point, like the book opens, like my book, Fight Magic Items opens with, a look at how the Japanese RPG genre was created. And then I sort of come into the narrative when the Super Nintendo is there with Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. And then it transitions into like, then the explosion happened, right? Final Fantasy VII hit. JRPGs went from selling like a hit, like a popular one would be about 500,000 to like, Final Fantasy VII selling like millions, right? But so the conceit of the book is like, okay, it was Final Fantasy VII riding on sort of the wave of the success of like the newfound love for anime in the West, but it was also Pokemon. And it's exactly what you're talking about, that Pokemon came a little after Final Fantasy VII. So Final Fantasy VII sort of like, like cleared the way a little bit with an older audience, but then Pokemon came in and it hit a younger audience, but it also hit these new Final Fantasy fans, right? New Japanese RPG fans, but it made it okay to go out and game in public, right?
Yeah.
Like, it made it okay to be out there talking to your friends about Pokemon, and like, it would create connections between people that wouldn't necessarily have talked before, right? Because everybody loved Pokemon, and it kind of fomented friendship and culture, and it created fights and strife as well, just the same way the trading cards and Magic the Gathering and Pogs and everything else did. But it like legitimized video games as a thing that you would talk about culturally on schoolyards, and then we grew up with that. Like, I was in high school by the time Pokemon came out, about halfway through high school, and it was like, we were playing a game with cute little monsters and trading them, but that was okay, right? We wouldn't have been caught dead with like, cute little monster other things, but Pokemon, it was okay. And I think that it took that success that Final Fantasy found and kind of creating an explosion of interest in the genre, and then like really solidified it as like a cross-generational thing, because younger kids were also able to get into it, and parents were also happy to give their kid a Game Boy, while dinner was on, to distract them for a little while, right? And it was a little cheaper to do that, a little easier because you weren't, sharing the living room TV and stuff. And Pokemon's impact on like the spread of Japanese RPGs, but also just like the popularization of like very Japanese games, and very Japanese ideas and stories and visuals. Like, I think you have to look at Pokemon and its impact as like an anime and a trading card game, and all of that together, like it shifted pop culture in the United States, and in Canada, in a way that like, can't be attributable to like any one other thing. Like Dragon Ball Z was big, and Sailor Moon was pretty popular and stuff, and all of those things are in one bubble together. But I think Pokemon hit a level of success like above and beyond that. That's covered also in a book called Pure Invention by Matt Alt, which looks at, it's kind of like Fight Magic Items. It looks at like but instead of looking at how Japanese RPGs got popular in the West, it's like how Japanese pop culture period sort of found its way over post World War II, and then hit sort of like this big growth period in the 90s, and how that's kind of gotten us to where we are now, where it's like just fully ingrained in especially video game culture.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. Good book recommendations. I'll have to check these out. Any games that you wish could have made it into the book?
I mean, man, the book could have been twice as long. It was already like, I pitched it at a certain word count. It's like significantly higher than that word count as is. It couldn't have been any longer. I edited it, I submitted it, and had to like cut about 11,000 words or something. That. 13,000 words. So like the first draft was even that longer. So like the book, there's so many things that I want to talk about. And it sounds like I'm working on some of the stuff, like some of the ideas that I wanted to put into the book, that I didn't end up getting to. I'm working on, pitching them as like freelance features and writing about them in other capacities. And part of the time what happened is like, I have so many words that I can write. The idea behind the book is like, it's the history of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the rise of Japanese RPGs in the West. So everything sort of had to like come back to one of those three things, right?
Oh, yeah.
Had to come back to Final Fantasy, had to come back to Dragon Quest, or it had to come back to like popularizing the genre in the West. And so like one thing that I really wanted to include in the book, and I was really excited about, was the Sega Saturn, which, was not popular in the West. It's an incredible Japanese RPG console. It has some, like the best versions of Grandia and Suikoden. It has like Panzer Dragoon Saga, which is like considered one of the best Japanese RPGs from that era, but like nobody's played it, and now it costs $12,000 or $1,200, right? It had like Magic Knight Rayearth and Albert Odyssey, like all these really interesting, fun Japanese RPGs that are kind of underappreciated in the West. It was a great Japanese RPG console in Japan, but it just flopped in the West. And so like I really wanted to dig into that and say like here's this console, like it's an incredible console for Japanese RPG fans if you can get to the Japanese games, right? And so like I wanted to fit that in the book, but it didn't. The Sega Saturn did not have an impact on Japanese RPGs in the West, right? And so like it was hard to be able to judge that in the book, spending 3,000 words looking at the Sega Saturn when it really didn't move the needle in terms of the book's overall narrative. And so like that, that was one that like I think is a fascinating story, was in my original outline and like made it to the very end. But like in the end, it was like, okay, does it support the book's overall narrative? And it didn't. And so I'm hoping, and it looks like I'll hopefully be able to tell that story in a different capacity. And there's so many stories and games like that in there. I would have loved to have dug into, the Trails in the Sky series more. I think that it's really fascinating the way that it's kind of like grown, like, Tales from Azure just came out. Trails from Zero, that's what it is. Trails from Azure is the next one. Okay. So you have like the Trails series, and Trails from Zero just came out, and it's like a big deal among Trails fans, right? And it's looking like it's going to be one of the best JRPGs of the year. I'm really excited to finally get to play it, but it came out 10 years ago. Like it's a 10-year-old game that came out on like the PC and the maybe the PSP. And so like Trails has had this real slow burn success in the West. And I think if I wrote this book in 5 years, Trails might end up becoming like a big part of the story in the second half.
Right.
But it's still in that growth period. And so like, I do write about Trails, and like I dig into the series a bit, but I think, if I came back in 5 years, I'd, probably be able to get a full chapter in there and justify a full chapter in there. When I started writing this book, I outlined it, right? And the outline was huge. It would have been 250,000 words, and nobody would have published that, right? And so I stressed over that a lot, because I didn't want people to read this and be like, oh, like, but what about this game? Like, oh no, this game shaped my childhood. Like, how could you forget that? And so I touch on this in the book, because like eventually I was like, you know what? Like, Japanese RPGs had their own journey to the West, but we all had our own journey within Japanese RPGs. And so once I was able to recognize like everybody's journey is different, there's no way I can tell everybody's story, but what I can do is I can tell my story. I can tell my perspective from the West, the perspective of the people that I speak to, the interviews and the reporting that I do. And I can, and I can recognize that. And then at the end of the book, I say like, there could have been a second version of this book that went into totally different series and looked at it and told a similar story through the lens of a different fan. And that would have been equally as valid. And we all have that own, that journey that we've gone on. But what remains consistent between all of us are the memories and the feelings that we have towards these games, right? So it doesn't necessarily matter if I'm talking about Suikoden or I'm talking about, the tales of games during the PlayStation era. Like, people who experience those felt the same feelings, and they feel the same way, and they have and carry that nostalgia now. And it's that kind of forms the core of the book. And so like, I picked the games that I covered and went into deeply based on how I felt like they impacted the rise in popularity to the West, how they kind of introduced new concepts or piggybacked off something that Final Fantasy did and brought it to an audience in a new way. It's not the definitive version of the Japanese RPG story, because there is no definitive version of that, right? There are people out there who have never played Suikoden, right? There are people out there who like, are obsessed with it. And to this day continue to write, fanfic about it or make games inspired by it.
Yeah.
And so, like the journey, there's 1,000 journeys for Japanese RPGs. And this one, covers my journey and the journey as I saw it as I went along. And there's so many more stories to tell. And hopefully I get to tell some of them, and then other people will get to come forward and continue to tell other ones based on how they see it. And I think that's what's kind of interesting again about, writing a living history, that like there's no one definitive path through any history. And so, as a writer, you try to find the kind of most honest version of that story that you lived and that you saw, and that
I think I lost you for just a second there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I have lost you on my end too.
I'm sure it was probably like Steam decided to start updating all my games at once. I thought I closed it, but
well, I've never understood why like people would limit bandwidth for like auto updates and stuff. Like I always see that setting, I'm like, no, F that. I want,
and then the moment
as fast as it possibly can.
Yeah. Then the moment it hits you. Exactly. Or like, God, even trying to like open an email once, I was like, what is happening? It's just exactly. Like, oh, but you were just in the middle of saying, talking about, offering the stories and the perspectives, as told from other people's voices, recording your own for posterity's sake. It felt like you were in the middle of making a great point, but
I don't know how far back you lost me, but the thing I discovered while writing the book is that, there is not one single definitive journey through the history of Japanese RPG. We all had our own experiences. And I wanted to write a book that felt, like a lot of people have described it as like, it feels like reading a book from a brother I never knew I had, right? Or sitting down with me at the pub, talking about our favorite games from when we grew up together. It's not necessarily specifically about like which niche titles or smaller games that I touched on. It was about making sure everybody's favorite game got equal screen time. It was about finding that story about what it was like growing up, playing these games, how that impacted us as players. But then also as you get through to the end of the book, looking at how those games impacted the people who are now making new video games. And so like, as I get to the end of the book, I interviewed a lot of indie creators who are looking back at Chrono Trigger, they're looking back at Phantasy Star, the experiences they had with those games as kids, and now trying to bring that to like a new audience, right? So like we're living now with the first generation of of game creators who grew up only ever knowing a world with video games, right? Hironobu Sakaguchi, Yuji Horii, they didn't know video games when they were a kid, right? That was new to them. But now you have, games like Quartet from Something Classic. You have Sea of Stars, which is coming out, and they're very clearly inspired by the classics from like the Super NES era. But these are creators who grew up playing Final Fantasy VI as kids, and now they have mortgages, they have kids, they have lives and careers, and they don't have as much time.
One thing I wanted to ask you, if we got time for it, is, is there, because to me, sometimes I make the mistake of feeling like the JRPG era is behind us, and it's like a time capsule. But you're describing games that are coming out and things like that. Are there anything that modern JRPGs are missing, that the golden age had?
For a long time, it was flexibility. It was like creative flexibility. Right. And I think you look back at those golden ages, and especially like pre-PlayStation, and the stakes, there were stakes there, but there was more kind of professional leash for a lot of a lot of these creators, because the expectations were different, right? And as we got into like later stages of gaming, as you have more publicly traded gaming companies, profit-focused gaming companies, that shapes how games are made, right? And so, you go and you look at what Final Fantasy, how the circumstances under which you have to make a Final Fantasy now are very different than Final Fantasy VI. Like Final Fantasy VI was made by a fairly small team, very small by today's standards, in under a year. Like, it's one of the greatest Japanese RPGs of all time, and it was made in under a year, right? Like, that's incredible. That could never happen now. If you consider Final Fantasy VI, like, that generation's, like, equivalent of a AAA game, which I think most people probably would. Like, compared to Final Fantasy 16 now, like, you couldn't do that, right? But where that's happening is the indie space. And I think like part of as you talk about the Japanese RPG, like you feel like it's a thing of the past. I think what's happening is, as I was kind of saying earlier, is we now have like that generation of game creators that were growing up playing these games, coming to a place in their careers where they're now making games inspired by what inspired them as a kid, right? And what interested them as a kid. Like you talk about Pokemon, like Pokemon was inspired by Satoshi Tajiri's obsession with bugs. Like he dreamed it up as he was like a bug collector as a kid, and he wanted to bring that sort of idea to life. And so Pokemon started as this idea of like a bug collecting game, which you can totally see, right? You end up collecting monsters, but you can totally see how it would be bugs, right? And you have other people like Miyamoto. I think it was Miyamoto he kind of based Zelda, the original Zelda, on his explorations of like the forest. Right. Where he lived as a kid. He would just wander the forest and explore. And so that's where the inspiration for the original Legend of Zelda came from. So they were inspired by these like experiences they had as kids in the real world. Now you have kids who have grown up gaming as kids, and now they're making games based on what they enjoyed as kids. And I think that's leading to this resurgence. You don't have to be these big AAA games anymore, right? They don't have to be big, flashy PlayStation 5 games anymore. So you have indie studios creating stuff like Ayuden Chronicle, which is like a spiritual successor to Suikoden. But then you also have now Konami going, oh, hey, Ayuden Chronicle raised $4 million on Kickstarter. Clearly there's an audience here. Let's bring Suikoden back. So you have like the indie scene and indie developers sort of pushing larger developers into like re-entering that space of Japanese RPG that's inspired by that golden age, that golden era. And I think that's really fascinating, because in that indie space, there is sort of more of that creative freedom again. Yeah. And Japanese RPGs went through a real rough patch during like the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 era. And I call it the dark ages or the dark years in the book. And they had a real tough time transitioning into the HD era, right? But where they blossomed during that time was on handhelds. So you had like Game Boy Advance, you had Nintendo DS, you had the Sony PlayStation. And again, they were smaller, more agile development environments, right? That were leaning back, not trying to reinvent the genre. They were going back and looking at what worked in the past, because they have these low-powered hardware. So what can you make on the Game Boy Advance? Well, you can make a JRPG that kind of looks like a Super Nintendo game, right?
Yeah.
What can you make on the PSP? Well, you can make a JRPG that pretty much is a PlayStation 2 JRPG. And so you had this explosion of like really interesting titles on those handhelds. And I think the industry coming to a place where it's like, oh, okay, not every game has to be AAA. Like we can go in and we can make a game, and yeah, is it going to sell 9 million copies? Like, is it going to be Final Fantasy 15? Is it going to push those numbers? Like, no, but it's never meant to, right?
Yeah.
Crowdsourcing helps that. And then it also creates, like an environment where it's like, I think technical constraints can be really creatively freeing. And I think we're starting to see them moving back into that frame of mind again, and that's really, really interesting to me, right? Like you have something like Sea of Stars, or you have something like Quartet, and they aren't trying to push the limits with graphics. What they're doing is they're choosing a specific style, and they're really like going all in on that. They're making it really, a really beautiful modern representation of what that graphical style looked like, doing things that never could have happened back in 1996 on the Super Nintendo. But you look at it and you're like, yeah, this is what I remember Super Nintendo JRPGs looking like. And so once you have those sort of like technical limitations or those like guidelines, those to follow, you can be really creative in those because you're not swamped by limitless possibilities. You're not swamped by quarterly returns to keep investors happy. And so I think the indie scene in particular is going to be super vibrant over the next 5 years, 10 years. And I think that's going to push the the larger publishers into similar spaces. And I'm really excited for that.
Well, I think this is as good of a place as any to sort of bring this in for a landing. I really thank you for carrying this conversation and really like sharing your passion. It really like comes through in the way you're speaking, and especially in your writing. You kind of talked about how long the book was, and I was a little surprised when I picked it up. I was like, damn, he put that many essays into this thing.
Yeah.
But it's really great. And guys, I highly recommend that you go pick it up. I think you got links to it on fightmagicitems.rocks.
That's right. Fight Magic Items Rocks. That's
exactly.
Yeah.
So
I built a website. It's an all-in-one website. It's got everything you need. It tells you about the book. There's like a link to a preview. There's links to order in the book. Lots of review blurbs and all that kind of fun stuff. So if you're interested, that's the place to go.
Yeah, go check it out. Go get your hands on a copy of it. You could, of course, get yourself a ebook copy if you'd like, but I wanted to have one to hold up on camera when we talk. So
the ebook is great, but I am very proud of how that physical copy came out.
It looks great. It feels great. I already spilled coffee on it. I am sorry about that.
That's okay. I love a well-worn book.
Yeah.
I used to try to keep my books in like pristine condition, and then I was like, but what's the point? Books are meant to be read, right?
Exactly. And if something happens to it, I can always get, that's what I feel about. I used to take care of my mass market paperbacks. I was like, if something happens, I'll just buy another one. Exactly. I just want the book. But guys, even if you don't read it from cover to cover, there is lots of sort of self-contained bits that you can move in and out of. I highly recommend it. If one game doesn't speak to you, then go to the next game. You're bound to find something that you identify with. And what really spoke to me was just like, I don't know, just reminded me of being a kid, watching my brother play these games, him and his friends bringing their stuff to the house, piling in one room to play all at the same time. I think that's kind of something that's missing with the way that we play games these days. But who knows, might be coming back. Aidan, is there anything else that you want to plug before we sign off? What I want to plug, or who I want to plug, is the cover artist, because I'm like, it's hard to see on my camera, but I'm in love with the cover. It's by an artist named Sarah Alpha G. She is a big JRPG fan, and she put kind of all of her fandom into that and littered it with like Easter eggs, and it's a reference to Kingdom Hearts, there's references to Final Fantasy, there's so many things in there that just like, even now it's been over a year since I saw the sketches, and I'm still kind of like putting connections together, and she was amazing to work with. My publishing team at Running Press was incredible as well. Like every step of the way, I was working with people who love these games as much as I do, and I think that really shows through in the book itself, and they were just incredible creative partners, and so go check out Sarah's work. Her name's Sarah Alpha G, and
it's great. It's incredible. And I'm so proud to be able to kind of have a cover from her. And I'm still obsessed with her artwork. So I'd like to give her a little shout out there.
Yeah, and I think if people really wanted to, before Twitter dies out, they could follow you at A Dribble of Ink, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I don't know if you just said that. I'm sorry, but
no, that's great. Yeah, I'm on Twitter way too much. A Dribble of Ink, ADRIBBLEOFINK.
Yeah,
and who knows how long any of us will be there.
Yeah, but, it's all up in the air, you know, taking it day by day. But at least there, if somebody was so inclined, at least while you're active, they could maybe find when you are sharing your other work, because like you said at the beginning, you are a freelance writer as well, and you've written some really intriguing articles, including some that Craft Extra viewers might be interested in, about the resurgence of CRTs for retro gaming, which is something that we're kind of big at with Craft Computing, and I know some of you guys are as well. So there you go.
And I've got like you say, I've got a couple. I've got a lot of stuff out there which you can find just by Googling my name. It's centered around like retro RPG storytelling and gaming, and then I've got a few pieces in the cooker that are with editors that are like very specifically like connected to the book as well, which I'm really excited to share over the next couple of weeks. So it's it's a good time to be reading the book and kind of continuing that journey afterwards, because there's so much amazing content out there about Japanese RPGs and their story.
Cool, Aidan. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wonderful book. It has been a real treat to read. For fans of JRPGs or video games or game development or the history of such, go find it, get your hands on it. Like the video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I guess we'll catch you guys in the next video. Cheers all.